They used to say about world champion Alexander Ayekin that if you wanted to beat him, you had to beat him in the opening, the middle game, and the end game. You had to beat him in all three phases. 2 out of 3 was not going to do it. Well, it looks like the same can be said about Alireza Firouzja. If you want to beat him, you must beat him in all three phases. 2 out of 3 is not enough. And this game today against Nils Grandelius is a good example of that. This game was played at the Magnus Carlsen Invitational. It's a rapid game. Both sides have 15 minutes with a 10-second increment. Alireza Firouzja has the white pieces. Nils Grandelius, the top player from Sweden, almost rated 2,700, a very strong player, has the black pieces. Let's begin. Alireza starts with d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6, and then Alireza plays b3. Something of an annoying anti-King's Indian line. It's designed to challenge the bishop that's going to emerge on g7, and also makes it harder for black to play e5, one of the key ways that black attacks the center. Bishop g7, bishop to b2, controlling that e5 square. Castles e3, b6 to place the bishop on the long diagonal. Bishop e2, bishop to b7. And Grandelius has double fianchetto. Castles c5, attacking the center. a4, this has only been played 3 times, attacking this pawn structure on the queen side. And Grandelius plays cd4, ed4, then a6, preparing an eventual b5 push. Alireza plays c4, and then Grandelius plays d5. And it's already fair to say that Nils Grandelius has done quite well in the opening. Certainly he has clear equality and has faced no challenge whatsoever in getting a very good position out of the opening. So Nils Grandelius, with the black pieces, has equality, and he's done well in the first phase of the game, the opening phase. Alireza plays a5, dc4, bc4 is played, and now Alireza has the hanging pawns pawn structure with these 2 pawns isolated, no pawn on the b or e file. And Grandelius plays b5, immediately putting pressure on this c4 pawn. And it would be a mistake, a blunder, for Alireza to play c5 here. Even though it gives him this protected passed pawn, it also gives black a protected passed pawn, one that's even stronger because you can't attack its base. But Nils Grandelius, he could blockade these light squares, he can attack the base of the pawn chain. c5 is actually a blunder. Computers give black like +2 after c5. So Firouzja plays knight b to d2, defending the pawn, hoping that if Grandelius takes the pawn, he could take with the knight, maybe even hop into b6. Knight to e4 to trade off the piece. Grandelius has less space, so he'd like to trade off pieces. He also unblocks his nice bishop at g7. Firouzja avoids the trade. Pawn takes, bishop takes pawn. So now we have an isolated queen's pawn position, but Firouzja's pieces are not ideally placed to take advantage of the IQP. And now black is going to try to blockade on the d5 square. The knight goes to d6, the bishop retreats to d3, and bishop to d5. Nils Grandelius continues to play Firouzja really tough and has a good position. Knight to e5, a thematic idea with isolated queen's pawns. Knight to c6, challenging the knight, but also perhaps threatening to come to b4 to irritate this bishop at d3. Firouzja stops that. Knight takes e5, de5, knight, e4. Bishop takes, and now Nils Grandelius has the advantage of the 2 bishops in the position and continues to do well. Knight to c5, hitting the bishop at e4, so it retreats. Grandelius exchanges Firouzja exchanges queens. Rook at the d1, bishop to b5. The bishop is anchored by the pawn at a6, and it's doing quite well, controlling key light squares. f4. So Firouzja blocks this bishop on g7 by strengthening that e5 pawn, making it harder for him to activate the bishop. Here, the best idea is probably to play bishop h6 to attack f4, and then after g3, play g5 to create a weakness at f4 and open up some lines for the dark squared bishop. Nils Grandelius instead plays rook takes d1, rook takes d1, rook to c8, hitting the knight at c5, bishop b4. The bishop goes to f8 to possibly put more pressure on the knight at c5. G5 is still probably the best idea here. Bishop f8, e6. And this is an interesting move by Firouzja. It does create a pawn weakness in black's position, but it also unclutters this diagonal. So the bishop goes back. Now it's no longer blocked. King f2, pawn takes, knight takes, bishop f6, defending the pawn at e7 and keeping it from being captured by the knight. Knight goes back to c5. King f7, following the endgame principle of centralizing your king once queens are off the board. The king can become a strong attacking piece, so both players centralize their kings. h5, g3, king to e8, and rook to c1. So now we're entering the endgame phase. Nils Grandelius has done well in the opening, well in the middle game. Now let's take a look at what happens in the endgame. Now it's really hard to envision black losing this position. Yes, he has a weakness at e7. The pawn at a6 could become weak, but it's easily defended by the light-squared bishop. And he has the two-bishop advantage. It's hard to see black losing this position. But watch carefully how Firouzja slowly creates little weaknesses and really outplays Nils Grandelius in this endgame. King to f7, rook c2, rook to c6, h3, preparing g4 to gain space on the king side. Now, it seems like black is having a hard time finding a plan, and he actually retreats the rook back to c8. Computers show us that probably the best move here is, again, to go ahead and play g5. White doesn't really have any easy choices now. If he plays rook to f2 defending that pawn, then pawn takes, and now Firouzja would have 3 pawn weaknesses. If instead he advances the pawn, then after bishop e5, g4, bishop to f4 check, and his bishops are quite strong. Sort of, you see them crisscrossing and controlling key squares. The other option would be to just take, but then again, the bishops become very strong. So g5 was probably the best idea, but he retreats the rook to c8. The rook goes to d2, king goes to e8. Now g4, hg4, hg4. Now black has 3 isolated pawns. So we see Firouzja working on the structure. Now he has an even better structure than he had before. The rook goes to d8, rook d8, king d8, and now we have a pure minor piece endgame. Still not an easy position to win, even though Firouzja has a healthier structure. Again, the 2 bishops are quite strong. The knight goes to e6, and here the best move for black is probably king to c8. But he plays king to e8, and this really puts him in a very, very, very tough position. Firouzja plays knight to c7 check. And after king to d7, he takes the bishop at b5, pawn takes knight. Now look at the position. The 2-bishop advantage is gone, and Grandelius has 3 pawn weaknesses. Firouzja now has an outside passed pawn. Grandelius's pawn at b5 is blockaded, and Firouzja is in really good shape here. He plays g5, gaining space and limiting the scope of black's bishop. Now, it turns out here, the only hope black has for survival is probably found in the move bishop to b2. The idea is to check the king from behind at c1. But he instead plays the bishop to g7, and now already, just like that, black is completely lost. Watch how Firouzja wins this game. Okay, there are a couple of ways to win it. He could play a6, but Firouzja, always the showman, decides to play a spectacular move. Bishop takes e7, and the bishop cannot be taken, because if the king takes, he plays a6. And notice these green arrows here. They create what's called the square of the pawn. It's a 3 by 3 square because the pawn is 3 squares away from queening. Black's king would have to be able to get into this square in order to stop it. So the pawn cannot be stopped from queening. This king controls the square the bishop would have to be on. So he would just lose. He cannot take the bishop. So he plays the king to c6 to get into the square of that pawn, and Firouzja just retreats the bishop back to b4. The king goes to d5. Now a6. Again, we see this 3x3 square. Black has to put his king inside of it to stop it. And then Firouzja plays this beautiful move, bishop to c5. And again, the bishop cannot be taken because then just a7. And the pawn cannot be stopped. And now this pawn and this bishop create this barrier, keeping the black king from approaching the pawn. The bishop goes to b2. It's a little bit late, unfortunately, at this point. King to e4, bishop c1. Bishop to e3. Grandelius can't allow the bishops to be traded. The king and pawn endgame is an easy win for white. Bishop b2, bishop c5, bishop c1. Now king to e5. He's not going to repeat moves. He's got a winning position, so no repetition. Bishop d2, f5, gf5, g6. So now he's got these two separated passed pawns. Each is only 3 squares away from the queening square. Bishop h6 to control g7. King takes pawn, bishop g7. The king moves up to escort the pawn forward. Bishop c6, king to f7. King to c7. Now, bishop to e7. The idea is to play the bishop to f6, block this bishop out, and then there will be no way to stop the pawn's advance. King to b6, bishop to f6, keeps the bishop out, and after b4, g7, and Nils Grandelius resigned. A scary endgame from Firouzja. If you want a chance against this player, you got to beat him in all 3 phases. I hope you enjoyed this game. I hope you enjoyed the endgame. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.